Well, bridge, and we'll pause on the bridge and we'll tell a story there. And we'll go from there to Prospect, which is my freshman dorm. And anybody else live in Prospect? Good. And if you live in Wilder, raise your hand if you lived in Wilder. How about Porter? How about the South Mandel? All right. South Mandel is said to be the most haunted hall.
Well, that explains us.
Exactly, because there's a lot of haunting, students say, on this campus. So that will be our final destination of the tour. Doesn't that sound a little ominous? Final destination. But we will just, when we go there, we will have some light refreshments. Ghosts always serve light refreshments. light and airy themselves. They prepared some meringues and Twizzlers and other light sweets for us. So that's what we'll find at the end. And at that point, if you have any questions, and also along the way, if you have any questions, I'd sure be glad to answer them. Just a few words before we go into Porter about ghosts and what they mean to us. A few years ago, I started working on this project, which became the book Haunted Halls, Ghost Stories of American College Campuses. And it began because I was working as a faculty master at Binghamton University, where I teach in the English department. And I saw a plea that had been placed on a national housing listserv from a director of residential life at a well-known school in the New York City area. And this director said, please, please help us. I'm out of my mind with worry because all of the students in this residence hall think their hall is haunted. They won't sleep at night, they cry, they're fearful that something is touching them in the night, and we don't know what to do. Please, all of you working on other campuses, send me an email right now and tell me what I can do to get rid of this ghost. Several people wrote back. I did too. I said, well, have you thought of calling a priest? That might be a good idea. And they did actually do that. A priest came in and sprinkled a little salt, a little water, and the ghost went away. It actually settled down very nicely. But after that exchange, I realized that this was something that needed to be studied. If haunting was reaching that much of a fever pitch on different campuses, including Mount Holyoke, then I wanted to learn whatever I could about it. So I started visiting folklore archives, talking with students, emailing with students, just trying to learn about haunting any which way I could. And I was interested to hear how many stories were circulating at Mount Holyoke, because when I was here from 66 to 70, I never heard a ghost story. How many of you heard ghost stories when you were here?
No, we had other problems. I think we had other
demonstrations
issues.
and other issues.
That was a very turbid era. Vietnam War and
yes,
I think
strike against Cambodia.
I think other
That was
other things to fight for, and women liberation, and I think we had other issues than ghosts. Libby, do you believe in ghosts?
I believe that ghosts are very important. I believe that they contain important messages about culture, about socialization, about things that are important to us. But I don't take a stand one way or the other on whether they're real. Though I have had a couple of unusual experiences, but not on a college campus, so I'm afraid I can't really help to clear that one up. But I did come to one realization after I'd been working on the book for a while, and that was that of all the campuses where I'd found many ghost stories, there was a big correlation between school spirit and school spirits. So that if you find a campus that has a lot of ghosts, that's a really good sign. This shows that there's positive spirit here. There are happy things going on. The students take pride. They like to tell stories about their campus. And Mount Holyoke is certainly among one of the most spirited campuses I think that I have encountered in all of my research. I recently, maybe some of you also read the most recent Alumni Quarterly, where President Creighton is interviewed, and she says that Mount Holyoke has a very strong communal spirit. I think she's absolutely right in that this spirit is mirrored in the ghost stories that are told here now. I think also it's possible that the upswing in ghost stories in the late 1970s had something to do with the changes that happened around the 60s and early 70s when some of us were in school here. You know, Kate Ashbury, New Age spirituality, the political situation, the protests. I think there was something that made a change that seemed to make ghost stories more common. And I found that ghost stories are important to students in college for a lot of reasons. My book goes into a lot of tedious detail on that, but I'll just say really quickly that ghost stories are fun, they're exciting, they're scary, but in a good way, because you know you're safe when you're hearing them. And all the ghosts in the stories I've collected are good ghosts. They're helpful, they're nice, they're not trying to cause any trouble, at least not almost all of the time. And you learn a lot from the stories. You learn about how to live safely, how not to get too intensely involved in your studies, not to end up in the worst case scenario, such as you see in some of the stories about untimely deaths. So let's go into Porter. You ready to go in? And we're going to see if anything interesting happens. Well, as it gets a little darker, as we move along, who knows, there may be a new story. And all of us who went to Mount Holyoke, I think, remember a certain dessert that was based on the memory of good old Deacon Porter. What was that? Hat. Deacon Porter's hat, exactly. And wasn't it yummy?
Yes.
Yes, delicious. I liked it a lot. Came with hard sauce. It was a wonderful dessert. And so Deacon Porter was a kind of hero for us, wasn't he? He was one of the builders of the campus. He was in charge of erecting the first buildings. And I was reading a volume of Mary Lyon's letters recently in which she expressed her gratitude to him because he had very little money to work with, and he had to erect an entire campus on $60,000, which was not much for those days. So Deacon Porter was apparently a wonderful and very productive man. But how much did we hear about his wife, Clara Porter, when we were students? Nothing. Not too much. Well, legends are kind of the revenge of the spouse in this case, because apparently Clara Porter had a portrait painted of her. And Clara, the story says, and I'm not saying absolutely whether this is true or false because I don't know, but the legend says that Clara Porter was a very angry woman because her husband, the deacon, was very, very good friends with Mary Lyon. And Clara Porter did not like that. And so apparently, if you looked at the portrait of Clara Porter, which they say has been taken down because it disturbed people to look at it, if you looked at her eyes really closely and dared to stand in front of the portrait for a while, it would drive you insane. And you would be carted off to Belchertown. And you would never come back. Remember hearing about Belchertown? Yes. I remember hearing about that. You better watch it, girls. Because so apparently the portrait was there for a while, and then they had to remove it because it was so dangerous. But that was, they say, the true story of Clara Porter. The other story is about a woman in white. That's why I wore this white dress. And of course, many of us are going to be wearing white tomorrow in the parade, so we might say we're all spirits of Mount Holyoke, in our own way. There are several different accounts by students in the Mount Holyoke archive of people who woke up in the night and looked up and saw the spirit of a woman in white just sort of floating over their heads. And apparently it spread through the hall, and many people got very nervous, very worried about this. And so they asked what could be done to make this better. Nobody knew. And then one night, everybody was so nervous that one girl looked up and thought she saw a woman in white over the head of her friend Nicole, and she shouted, "Nicole, Nicole, there's a woman in white over your head." And it turned out it was a fern. Oh. It was a hanging fern. And they remembered this so sharply, they wrote it all up and put it in the archive. So that's a story that was just sort of comic relief. But most of these are really pretty serious. They're personal experiences, people who talk about these things happening, and they tell the stories as true. They're not just to entertain. It's hot in here. Let's go on to Wilder.